He just wanted to do some repairs in the basement of his old house. But when the father broke through a wall that had been sealed for 100 years, what he saw inside made him call the FBI. No one in the town could believe what had been hidden right beneath their feet. Subscribe to the channel and comment below. Where are you watching this video from? The morning light spread over the rolling hills of Pennsylvania, soft and gold, like it was trying to apologize for the night before. Dew clung to the tall grass, each blade glittering in silence. In the middle of the field stood Richard Collins, a man carved by work and loss. His boots sank into the damp earth where his wife, Sarah, had taken her last breath 3 years ago. The old tractor that killed her still sat by the tree line, rust creeping along the fenders. He couldn't bring himself to move it. Every year he told himself he would, and every year it stayed. It wasn't just a machine. It was the line between what his life used to be and what it had become. The house stood half a mile from the road, its white paint long faded to a weary gray. It had been in the Collins family since 1898. His grandfather built it when the town was little more than a cluster of farms. The boards creaked under every step, the windows whistled in the wind, but the walls held steady like Richard himself, weathered but unbroken. Inside, voices echoed, 7 children moving through the morning like a small army. The twins fought over cereal, the baby cried for attention, and somewhere upstairs his oldest daughter, Emily, packed another box she'd never admit was for leaving. Richard paused by the porch, watching the fog lift off the field. He could almost see her there, Sarah standing with her hands in her apron, hair pulled back, calling the kids in for breakfast. For a fleeting moment he thought he heard her voice again, the tone of it, the rhythm of a life that used to make sense. But the sound was only the wind moving through the apple trees. Inside, the house smelled of coffee and worn wood. The breakfast table was full, but the conversation was thin. The children talked around their father rather than to him. Emily barely looked up from her phone. Luke, 19 and restless, shoveled eggs into his mouth, pretending he wasn't angry that the tractor still sat where it had killed his mother. Richard noticed everything but said nothing. He'd learned that silence was easier to live with than arguments that had no end. After breakfast, he went down to the basement. The light switch didn't work anymore, so he carried a lantern. The air was damp, thick with mildew. Wooden shelves lined the walls, filled with jars of nails, old tools, and relics of a life too busy for reflection. But today his eyes were drawn to the far wall, an archway sealed with uneven bricks. It had always been there, but he'd never given it much thought. He'd heard his grandfather mention something about a wine cellar once, sealed off for good reason. Richard touched the mortar. It was brittle under his fingers. The pattern of the bricks didn't match the rest of the foundation, and the arch at the top gave it an almost ceremonial look, like a doorway meant to be forgotten. That night, when the children were asleep and the house had gone quiet, Richard found himself drawn back downstairs. He carried a bottle of bourbon and the old family photo album. He sat at the workbench, flipping through the pages until he found the photograph that had been haunting him for months. The day he and Sarah bought the farm from his father. She stood in front of the house, sunlight in her hair, the twins holding her legs, smiling like the world couldn't possibly turn dark. Behind her, in that same photo, through the cellar window, there was something strange, a faint outline of a brick arch, freshly sealed even then. He ran a hand down his face and whispered to the empty air, "You always said this house had secrets, didn't you, Sarah?" The next morning he decided to start the repairs he'd been putting off for years. That was the excuse he gave himself anyway. The truth was harder to name. He cleared the basement of debris, swept the dust, and set the lantern near the bricked arch. Luke joined him after a while, leaning against the stairs with his arms crossed. "You really think there's anything behind there?" the boy asked. "Only one way to find out," Richard said, his tone steady but his hands trembling slightly as he picked up the hammer. The first strike echoed through the whole house. A puff of dust rained from the ceiling. The second blow loosened the edge of the mortar, revealing a darker layer beneath. The sound drew some of the younger children to the top of the stairs, curious eyes peeking into the dim basement. "Dad, are you making a mess again?" one of the twins called. "Just fixing what's broken," Richard replied. He kept swinging. The repetition of it felt cleansing, like the sound of something waking up after a long sleep. Sweat mixed with the dust on his face. After an hour, only a shallow dent marked the wall. Whoever built it had wanted it to last. That night his dreams were full of sound, the clink of chains, the creak of wooden doors, voices whispering words he couldn't understand. He woke before dawn, heart pounding, the taste of iron in his mouth. He went back to the basement before the sun rose. The lantern flickered, casting long shadows across the stone floor. The wall seemed to look back at him now, daring him to continue. At breakfast, Emily confronted him. "You've been down there every night for a week, Dad. The house smells like dust and mildew. You're not 20 anymore. What are you even looking for?" He didn't look up from his coffee. "Something that doesn't belong here." "Like what? Ghosts?" "Like the truth," he said quietly. Her expression softened for a second before hardening again. "You're losing it. Maybe you should just let things stay buried." He didn't answer. She left for town soon after, slamming the door behind her. Later that day, as the autumn light faded, he went back to the cellar. Luke followed silently, this time bringing a sledgehammer. The two of them worked side by side until the mortar began to crumble. Dust filled the air. They coughed, laughed a little, and kept going. The smell that came from the cracks wasn't just damp, it was old, like the inside of a tomb. The air felt colder the deeper they dug. Finally, after hours of pounding, one brick gave way with a hollow clink. A faint draft slipped through, cool and stale. Luke peered into the gap. "Feels like there's space behind it." Richard nodded, wiping his forehead. "We'll find out soon enough." When they stopped for the night, he sat alone at the edge of the basement steps, lantern burning low beside him. The shadows around the archway danced and shifted, taking strange shapes in the flickering light. He thought of Sarah again, her voice, her laugh, the way she used to hum when she baked. He remembered how she once said that the land carried memory, that every brick in this house had heard something. He hadn't believed her then. Now he wasn't so sure. As he stood to go upstairs, he looked back one last time at the wall, at the hole that had started to form in its center. The wind outside pushed through the cracks in the old foundation, making the lantern flame lean and tremble. For a second, he thought he heard something, a whisper too soft to be real, coming from the darkness behind the bricks. "Don't stop!" He froze, the hammer still in his hand. The whisper faded into the hum of the night, leaving only the echo of his own breathing. He told himself it was just his mind, the exhaustion, the bourbon still running in his veins. But as he climbed the stairs, he couldn't shake the feeling that the wall wanted to be opened, that it had been waiting a very long time for someone to listen. When he reached the top, the youngest of his children stood in the hallway, rubbing sleep from his eyes. "Dad," the boy murmured, "were you talking to someone?" Richard hesitated before answering. "No, buddy, just the house." He led the child back to bed, tucked him in, and stayed there until the boy's breathing slowed. Then he looked out the window at the field beyond, the same one where his wife's cross stood. The sky was pale gray, and the first snow of the season began to fall, settling softly on the dark soil. He thought about what Emily said, about letting things stay buried, but he couldn't, not anymore. He went back downstairs, picked up the sledgehammer, and set the lantern on the floor. The wall loomed before him, cracked and waiting. He took a deep breath, feeling the cold air fill his lungs, and raised the hammer high. "All right," he whispered to the empty cellar. "Let's see what you've been hiding." By the next morning, the cellar looked like a battlefield. Dust hung in the air. The floor was littered with broken bricks, and the old archway yawned open like a wound in the wall. The first light of dawn slipped through the tiny basement window, landing on the hole Richard and Luke had made the night before. The air that came through it was colder than the rest of the cellar, so cold it made their breath visible, even in late autumn. Richard set down his coffee mug on the workbench, staring at the hole as if it might change shape if he looked long enough. Luke arrived a few minutes later, dragging the sledgehammer behind him. Neither said much. They didn't have to. They both knew they were going to finish what they started. When the first blow of the day landed, the sound was deeper than before, as though something inside the wall had hollowed out over the years. Bits of mortar and dust spilled onto the floor. With every strike, the gap widened, and soon the outline of the old arch was clear again. There was a strange symmetry to it, precise, careful, almost artistic. Whoever had sealed it hadn't been in a hurry. It was built to stay closed, but nothing lasts forever. After nearly an hour, a chunk of the wall gave way, revealing a black void beyond. The smell that drifted out was sharp and musty, a blend of rotting wood and stale air, untouched for generations. Luke leaned forward with the flashlight, its thin beam slicing into the dark. "There's a room back there," he said, voice low, almost reverent. "I think, yeah, there's furniture." Richard took the light from him and crouched. The beam revealed a narrow passage leading into a small chamber beyond. The walls were stone, slick with moisture, and the ceiling arched just high enough for a man to stand upright. Dust floated in the air like slow-moving snowflakes. He stepped inside first, his boots crunching over debris that had turned soft with age. Luke followed, holding his shirt over his nose. The air felt heavy, as if it hadn't been breathed in 100 years. Against the far wall stood a wooden table covered in layers of dust. On it sat a rusted lantern, a few glass bottles, and a stack of yellowed papers curled at the edges. Beside it, a trunk with an iron latch waited, the lock long corroded. In one corner stood a cot, its mattress blackened and eaten by time. A single child's shoe lay on the floor beside it, small enough to fit in the palm of a man's hand. Above the cot, pinned to the wall with a rusted nail, was a piece of parchment with faded ink. Richard brushed it gently with his thumb. It was a letter. The handwriting was elegant and deliberate, the kind no one used anymore. The name at the bottom made his chest tighten. Abigail Moore, 1903. He read the first line aloud, his voice echoing softly through the chamber. "To whoever finds this, know that we tried to do what was right." He swallowed hard and continued, the words trembling out of his mouth. "If this is discovered, it means they didn't let us leave. God forgive us all." He stopped reading. The words were too strange, too close to something sacred and wrong at the same time. Luke looked at him, confused but afraid to speak. They turned to the trunk. With a groan of rusted hinges, Richard forced it open. Inside were several bundles wrapped in oilcloth, brittle and dark. He unwrapped the first one and froze. It wasn't money or tools, it was a stack of black and white photographs. The faces in them were stiff and formal, dressed in late 19th century clothes. One photograph showed a group of men standing in front of the very same house they were in now, though the porch was new and the trees behind them still young. In the center of the group was a man whose resemblance to Richard was unmistakable. The inscription on the back read, "Elijah Collins, 1899. Luke frowned. "That's him, isn't it? Great-grandpa?" Richard nodded slowly. "Yeah, that's him." There were more photographs, most of them damaged by mold and time. A few showed women and children. One in particular caught Richard's eye, a woman with her hair pinned high, holding a baby on her lap. The handwriting on the back matched the letter, Abigail and Henry Moore, spring 1902. He felt the chill deepen in his bones. The Moores had lived here, on this same land, before the Collins family took over. He'd known the name from old records, but no one in town ever spoke about them. Luke moved toward the back of the room and brushed away cobwebs that hung like curtains. Behind them were faint drawings scratched into the stone lines, arrows and shapes that looked like maps. He turned the light closer. They were diagrams of the property, but the boundaries were different, smaller, divided. In one corner, a name was carved, Collins Line. Another, fainter. Beneath it read, Moore Farm. A single arrow connected them, drawn in haste, pointing from one to the other. Beneath the marks, almost hidden under centuries of dust, someone had written 2 words in charcoal. "Forgive us." The air felt thicker then, pressing against their skin. Richard turned off the flashlight for a moment, letting his eyes adjust to the natural gloom. The room was silent, but not empty. It was the kind of silence that feels watched. Somewhere behind the walls, the house groaned. The foundation shifted slightly, sending a shower of dust down from the ceiling. He turned the light back on, and for a heartbeat he thought he saw something move, a trick of the shadows. Nothing more, but enough to make his pulse race. They left the chamber without saying a word. Upstairs, the noise of the house seemed too loud, too alive. The kettle whistled on the stove. The twins argued over who got the last pancake, and for a moment the normalcy of it all made the discovery feel like a dream. But the grime on Richard's hands and the dust in his hair said otherwise. He poured a glass of water, hands shaking slightly. Luke sat at the table across from him, silent. "You think we should tell someone?" the boy asked. "Tell them what?" Richard said. "That we found an old room with a bunch of junk and a letter from a ghost?" He took a long drink, then set the glass down harder than he meant to. "No, not yet." That night, after the kids were in bed, he took the letter back out and read it again by the light of his lantern. The handwriting wavered with his breathing. The more he read, the less it sounded like a letter, and the more it felt like a confession. Abigail wrote about voices of conscience and a debt that must be repaid. She mentioned names, Elijah Collins among them, and spoke of a night when fire consumed everything. She ended the letter with a plea. "If any good remains in the blood that built these walls, let the truth be known. Let the innocent be remembered." Richard set the page down slowly. He could hear Sarah's voice in his head, telling him how history always hides beneath the floorboards if you listen long enough. He couldn't sleep. Near midnight, he went outside and stood on the porch. The moonlight washed the fields in silver. In the distance, the outline of the old tractor looked like a grave marker against the horizon. The house behind him seemed to breathe. He lit a cigarette, something he hadn't done in years, and stared at the faint plume of smoke rising into the cold air. He wondered if Sarah had known, if she had tried to tell him something about the house before she died. There had been moments, small ones, when she looked at the old family portraits and grew quiet, like she recognized something wrong that she couldn't quite name. The next morning he called his neighbor, Frank Miller, a man well into his 80s who had grown up just down the road. Frank came over with his old dog and a thermos of black coffee. When Richard showed him the photographs and the letter, Frank's face went pale. He sat down heavily on the basement steps, staring into the hole in the wall. "You shouldn't have opened that," he said quietly. "That part of the house. It's got history you don't want to stir." "What kind of history?" Richard asked. Frank hesitated. "The kind that got people run out of town. Some things were done here, long before my time. Deals made. People disappearing. The Moores, well, they weren't the only ones who lost more than land." "You're saying my family had something to do with it?" Frank didn't look up. "I'm saying this county's got roots deeper than most care to admit, and some of them are rotten. Close it back up, Richard. Seal it before it takes more out of you than it already has." When the old man left, Richard stood in the basement for a long time, staring into the dark opening. Dust motes drifted lazily through the beam of his flashlight. On the far wall inside, the word "forgive" was still visible in faint black strokes. He wanted to do what Frank said, to wall it back up, forget it existed. But he couldn't. Not now. There was something in that room that belonged to him, something he didn't yet understand. He picked up the letter again, folded it neatly, and slipped it into his jacket pocket. As he turned to go upstairs, the light from the lantern flickered and died. The darkness swallowed the room in an instant. For a brief, breathless moment, the silence was complete, until the faint creak of the cot came from behind the wall, slow and deliberate, like the sound of weight shifting on the old springs. He froze where he stood, heart pounding in his chest. But when he turned the flashlight back on, the room beyond was empty, still, unchanged. Only the shoe remained where it had fallen, tipped slightly toward the doorway, as though waiting for someone to come back. Richard backed away slowly, sealing the cellar door behind him. Upstairs, the house was quiet again, the children asleep. But the peace felt different now, fragile, as if the walls themselves were listening. He stood in the kitchen, the letter still warm in his hand, and realized that he was no longer sure what frightened him more, the past that waited behind the bricks, or the fact that it might already be part of him. The morning after Frank's visit broke gray and silent. The house felt different now, as if its walls knew they had been exposed. Richard barely touched his breakfast. The children noticed, though no one spoke of it. Even Luke, who usually filled the silence with his restless energy, kept his head down. The younger kids bickered quietly over toast, but the noise sounded thin, unnatural. Every so often, Emily glanced toward her father, as if she wanted to ask what he'd found in the basement, but didn't quite dare. When the phone rang, the sudden sound made them all flinch. Richard let it ring twice before answering. It was the local librarian, a woman named Paula, who had known Sarah well. She said she'd found something interesting in the old township archives, a set of property deeds from the turn of the century that might answer some of his questions. He thanked her, though his voice came out hollow. After he hung up, Emily finally asked the question that had been sitting on everyone's tongue. "Dad, what's going on? You've been down there for days. You're acting like something's chasing you." Richard didn't look at her. "I just need to understand what's been hidden under our feet," he said. "Your mother used to say that everything here has a memory. I think she was right." He drove to the library after lunch, the road winding between fields already stripped bare by the season. The sky hung low, full of snow that refused to fall. The building stood on the edge of town, red brick and quiet as a church. Inside, the air smelled of paper and time. Paula led him to a back room lined with metal drawers and folders, labeled by decade. She placed a thin file on the table and opened it carefully. "Here," she said, pointing to a faded signature. "Moore Farm, purchased by Elijah Collins, 1904. But there's something strange. The record says transfer by court order rather than sale. That means there was a dispute." She handed him another document, half burned along the edges. It was a newspaper clipping from 1903. "Fire destroys Moore homestead family, presumed dead. Neighbors cite divine retribution." Richard stared at the words. The article went on to mention a hearing that was scheduled but never held. The date matched the month before the fire. Beneath the type was a list of names, including his great-grandfather. He ran a hand across the fragile page. "How did this end up here?" he asked. Paula shrugged. "A lot of old records were sealed after the courthouse fire in 1921. No one wanted to revisit those years. But if you're serious about digging into it, you should talk to Allison Gray. She's doing a thesis on early land disputes in the county. Teaches over at the university." He thanked her and drove home through a curtain of light snow. The closer he got, the darker the day seemed to grow. When he stepped through the front door, he heard the twins arguing upstairs, Emily's voice raised in frustration, and the radio playing a melancholy country song. For a fleeting moment, it felt almost normal again. Then he caught sight of the open basement door. Luke was standing at the top of the stairs, his face pale. "Dad," he said quietly, "someone's been down there." Richard's stomach tightened. He walked past his son and descended the steps 2 at a time. The air was colder than before, sharp enough to sting his throat. The lantern he'd left on the table had been knocked over, its glass cracked. The letters and photographs were scattered across the floor. For a long minute he stood there, saying nothing, listening for footsteps above, for breathing that wasn't his own. Then he crouched and began gathering the papers. Nothing seemed missing, but the trunk in the hidden room was open again. Inside it, a photograph he'd never seen lay on top of the others. It showed a group of men standing by the creek behind the property, a small wooden sign in the background that read, "Willow Creek, 1903. They were dressed in suits and hats, but there was something grim in their expressions, as if the moment had been stolen from the aftermath of something terrible. Scrawled across the back, in faded pencil, were 2 words, "We're sorry." That night sleep wouldn't come. When he finally drifted off, the dreams were vivid and cold. He was standing in the same creek bed, but the water was gone, replaced by a field of ashes. Smoke rose from blackened beams where the Moore house once stood. A woman's voice whispered his name, though he couldn't tell whether it came from the air or from inside him. He woke drenched in sweat, the taste of smoke still on his tongue. The next day he called Allison Gray. Her voice was calm and warm, the kind of voice that sounded like it belonged to someone who believed in reason. She agreed to meet him at the farm that afternoon. When she arrived, her car crunched over the gravel drive, and she stepped out wearing a gray coat dusted with snow. She looked younger than he expected, though her eyes held the quiet seriousness of someone who spent her life reading about ghosts that weren't supernatural, but historical. He showed her the photographs, the letter from Abigail Moore, and the maps scratched into the wall. She studied them carefully, taking notes in a small leather notebook. "This is remarkable," she said softly. "I've seen references to the Moore fire before, but the official records say the family line ended there. You're telling me their home is beneath yours?" "Not beneath," Richard said. "Within." They moved between the rooms of the house as she asked questions, pausing often to listen to the creaks and groans of the old beams. When they reached the cellar, she stopped before the archway, flashlight in hand. "You've opened something very old," she murmured. "And very personal? I can't be sure, but the Moors were known abolitionists in the late 1800s. If your ancestors were tied to them through land deals, it's possible this was more than just a property dispute." Richard felt a chill. "You're saying there might have been violence?" "I'm saying history doesn't bear itself without reason," she answered, "and someone took great care to wall this place off." As she left that evening, she promised to check university archives for anything linking the Collins and Moore families. When her car disappeared down the road, Richard stood on the porch for a long time, watching the snow settle on the fields. He thought about Sarah again, how she had once found an old journal in the attic and insisted there was more to the family story than anyone wanted to admit. He'd brushed it off then, saying she was chasing ghosts. Now it felt like she had been trying to warn him. Over the next week, Allison sent him copies of court records, personal letters, and tax documents she uncovered. Each one added a new layer to the puzzle. The Moores had accused Elijah Collins of falsifying deeds and bribing officials to take over their land. When Abigail threatened to expose him, their house burned to the ground. No arrests were ever made. Months later, Collins purchased the property through an emergency auction held by the county, unopposed. The whole story had been buried until now. At home, the tension grew thicker. Emily confronted him one evening while he sat at the kitchen table, surrounded by papers. "You've got to stop this," she said, her voice trembling. "You're scaring everyone. The little ones think the house is haunted, and Luke says he saw lights in the basement last night." Richard looked up slowly. "I'm trying to make sure no one else ever has to be afraid of this house again." "Maybe that's not your job," she snapped. "Maybe you should be their father, not some kind of grave digger." Her words hit harder than she meant. She stormed upstairs, leaving him alone with the sound of the wind rattling the windows. He turned his attention back to the documents, but the words blurred together. There, among the legal jargon and dates, he found something that made him go still. A statement from 1904, signed by a Reverend Charles Walker. It read, "Let it be known that those who confess their sins did so beneath the Collins house, seeking the mercy of God before they sealed it away." Beneath the signature, a faint note had been added in different ink. "Forgive us." The same phrase that had been written on the wall in the hidden room. The next morning he visited Frank again, hoping for answers. The old man looked weaker than before, his dog asleep at his feet. When Richard showed him the clipping, Frank sighed heavily. "Reverend Walker was my grandfather," he said. "He used to tell me stories when I was little. Said our town was built on a lie. That one night some men gathered in secret to cleanse themselves of what they'd done, but instead they just buried it deeper. He was there when they sealed that room." "Why didn't anyone talk about it?" "Because they all had blood on their hands, and because people like your family made sure the story stayed quiet." Richard drove home with his hands gripping the wheel so tightly his knuckles ached. By the time he reached the house, the sun had set, and the windows glowed faintly with the soft light of home. Inside, the children were watching television, laughter echoing through the living room. For a moment, the warmth of that sound almost broke him. But when he passed the basement door, the handle was cold to the touch, as if something on the other side had been waiting for him to come back. He thought of the letter, the photographs, the fire, and the plea written in charcoal on the wall. He knew then that this wasn't just about history anymore. It was about inheritance, about what it meant to carry the weight of those who came before. That night he couldn't keep still. He returned to the cellar, lantern in hand, and stood before the black arch. The air was still, but it felt like it was listening. He spoke softly, though he wasn't sure to whom. "I'm not here to hide you," he said. "I just want to understand." The lantern flickered once, and for a heartbeat, it seemed like the shadows deepened behind the wall. He thought he saw movement again, a shape curling back into the darkness. But when he blinked, it was gone. What remained was silence, thick, patient, and alive. Upstairs, the clock struck midnight, its chime echoing faintly through the beams. He turned off the lantern and stood in the dark for a long time, feeling the weight of his family's name pressing down on him. Outside, snow began to fall again, covering the fields and the creek, soft and soundless, as if the world itself was trying to hide what had been uncovered. The winter deepened around the Collins farm, the snow falling thicker each day until the hills disappeared under a white stillness that muffled even the wind. Richard had begun to feel that same cold settling in his bones, not from weather, but from the weight of what he now knew. The papers Allison uncovered made the connection between his family and the Moores undeniable. His great-grandfather had taken their land through fraud and fire. The house he lived in, the ground beneath his children's feet, all of it was built on that betrayal. He told himself that history couldn't touch them now, that the dead couldn't claim the living, but the house whispered otherwise. At night the walls creaked like someone walking unseen. The smell of smoke sometimes drifted through the vents when the fire in the hearth had long gone out. He sent copies of the documents to the county courthouse, demanding an investigation into the old property transfer. It was an act he thought would bring relief, but instead it drew attention he hadn't expected. Within days, the sheriff stopped by under the pretense of checking on the family, his tone too polite, his eyes too curious. Then a man from the bank called, reminding him that his mortgage payment was overdue, even though he knew it wasn't. When Richard drove into town, he could feel the weight of glances following him from the diner window, the hardware store, the post office. No one said anything directly, but their silence was louder than words. The Collins name had carried respect here for generations, but now it carried something else, something uneasy. At home, the tension was worse. Emily had left for her friend's apartment in Harrisburg after another argument that ended with slammed doors and tears. Luke worked late shifts at the mill just to avoid being around. The younger children spoke in whispers when they thought he couldn't hear. He tried to keep the farm running, but the fields were frozen and his mind was elsewhere. Most evenings he sat at the kitchen table surrounded by boxes of papers, tracing signatures, comparing handwriting, trying to piece together the story as if understanding it might change what was already done. The only person who came willingly was Allison. She visited every few days, bringing folders from the university archives. Her calm presence a fragile thread of sanity in the chaos. One afternoon, while they sat by the kitchen window watching the snow fall, she said quietly, "You're in danger of becoming part of the same silence that buried them, Richard. If you let fear stop you now, then this house wins." He looked at her, exhausted. "You don't understand. This isn't just about history anymore. Someone broke into my cellar. Someone's been in my house." "Then the truth's already coming for you," she said. "Don't let it be for nothing." That night he dreamed again of fire. He was running through the woods, smoke thick around him, Sarah's voice calling his name from somewhere he couldn't reach. When he woke, the house smelled faintly of kerosene. His heart slammed in his chest as he ran downstairs. In the cold light of dawn, he found the side door to the barn ajar and fresh footprints in the snow leading away toward the road. The lock was broken. Inside, a small pile of charred hay smoldered in the corner where someone had tried to start a fire and failed. He knelt to touch the blackened straw, his hands shaking. The message was clear. Stop digging, or next time they wouldn't miss. He called the sheriff, but when the deputy arrived, his inspection was perfunctory. "Probably some kids fooling around," he said with a shrug. "Nothing to worry about." He didn't take notes. He didn't even look closely at the footprints. When Richard pressed him, the deputy gave a thin smile and said, "People around here don't like troublemakers. Best to keep things quiet." After he left, Richard stood in the yard staring at the barn, the snow now falling so hard it blurred the world to white. For the first time since Sarah's death, he felt something burning hotter than grief-anger. He walked back inside, took out the box of documents, and called Allison. "If the law won't listen," he said, "then the country will. I'm going to the papers." She tried to dissuade him at first, warning that the town would turn against him completely, that the story could ruin what was left of his family's life. But he had already decided. Within a week, a reporter from the Boston Globe drove out to interview him. She took photographs of the old house, the cellar, the letters, the hidden chamber. Her questions were sharp, her disbelief fading as she read Abigail Moore's letter aloud. "If this is real," she said, "it's one of the earliest documented acts of racial and land suppression in this county. People will pay attention." Word spread faster than Richard could have imagined. Within days of the article's online release, the phone wouldn't stop ringing. Some calls were from historians and journalists wanting interviews. Others came late at night, hang-ups, muffled breathing, a whisper of static. Then came a letter with no return address. Some truths should stay buried. The words were printed on paper so old it crumbled at the edges. He showed it to Allison. She told him to contact the FBI. He hesitated, but the memory of the burned hay finally pushed him. 2 days later, unmarked vehicles rolled up the long driveway, and men in dark coats began moving methodically through the house. The agents took samples from the cellar walls and photographs of everything inside. When they broke through the rest of the sealed passage, they uncovered a narrow tunnel that extended beneath the yard toward the creek. The air inside was damp and foul. Near the end of the tunnel lay what looked like fragments of wooden crates, some blackened, some still faintly marked with numbers. And then they found the bones 3 adult skeletons, and one small enough to belong to a child, all half buried in the mud. For a long moment no one spoke. One of the agents knelt, brushing the dirt from a small shoe that matched the one Richard had found months before. By evening, the farm was swarming with lights. The local news vans came, their cameras cutting through the snow like knives. Neighbors gathered at the edge of the property, watching as stretchers were carried out under white sheets. Richard stood on the porch, numb. He heard one agent say quietly that the remains would be taken to Washington for identification. Another murmured that the scene appeared deliberate, no signs of collapse, only careful burial. When the agents left, Allison stayed behind. "You did what had to be done," she told him softly. "Now it's out in the open." But truth has its own price. The next morning, graffiti covered the barn doors. Traitor. The hardware store refused to serve him. The post office lost his mail. Emily called from Harrisburg in tears, saying her friends had seen his name on the news, that people online were accusing the family of fabricating the story for attention. Luke, silent and angry, packed a bag and left for good. The younger children watched everything in silence, their faces pale with confusion. Richard tried to explain, but how could he tell them that the world would rather live with a lie than face its own reflection? The night after the story broke nationally, the farmhouse went dark. Someone had cut the power line. He lit candles and waited, shotgun resting across his knees. Every creak of the house, a threat. Around midnight, headlights appeared at the end of the driveway, paused, then turned away. He didn't sleep until dawn. When morning came, he found tire tracks frozen into the snow and the sound of a helicopter circling somewhere distant. The FBI had returned, this time with a formal statement. The remains were authentic, and preliminary analysis confirmed that at least 2 of the victims matched the Moore family through surviving genealogical records. What had started as a local mystery was now a federal case. The town couldn't ignore it any longer. Reporters flooded the courthouse steps, shouting questions at men who refused to answer. The mayor released a statement expressing deep regret for the past, but condemned reckless individuals stirring division. On social media, half the comments hailed Richard as a hero. The other half called him a liar. He didn't care about either side anymore. He only wanted his family safe, but the damage was done. His children couldn't go to school without stairs. Neighbors crossed the street when they saw him. Even Allison received threats for helping him. On the night the FBI concluded their excavation, Richard walked out into the field where Sarah had died. The moon was full, the snow glittering under its light. The wind carried the faint smell of ash from the burned barn, now little more than a skeleton of black beams. He stood there for a long time, listening to the quiet. Somewhere deep inside, a strange calm settled over him. He had wanted to bring peace to this place, and instead he had unleashed everything that peace had hidden. But there was no turning back now. Truth had taken root, and even if it destroyed what was left of his world, it was alive again. When he returned to the house, the children were asleep in the living room, curled together under blankets. He covered them gently and sat by the dying fire. The last embers glowed faintly, their light flickering across the photographs spread on the floor. He picked up the one of Abigail and her child and placed it beside a picture of Sarah holding their youngest son. The resemblance between the 2 women struck him in a way that made his throat tighten. He whispered into the silence, "It's done now. Whatever comes next, it's yours again." Outside, the snow began to fall once more, soft and endless, erasing the footprints that led away from the house. By dawn, everything was white again, but the quiet was different this time. It was not the silence of ignorance or fear. It was the pause that comes after a confession, when the truth at last has nowhere left to hide. Spring came slowly to Willow Creek that year, as though the earth itself hesitated to wake. The snow melted in streaks, revealing the dark soil beneath, heavy and cold. For months the house had been filled with strangers, investigators, historians, journalists. But now at last it was quiet again. The yellow tape that once marked the yard was gone. The trucks had rolled away, the cameras had turned elsewhere, and all that was left was the house and the silence that followed truth. Richard stood on the porch one morning watching mist rise from the thawing fields. The land looked different now. It no longer belonged to the Collins name in the way it once had. It belonged to something older, something that had outlasted all of them. The FBI had closed the case 2 weeks earlier. The remains were confirmed to be those of Abigail Moore, her husband Henry, their young son, and an unidentified laborer who had worked on their farm. The records proved the Moores had been killed before the fire that destroyed their house, and that the blaze had been set to erase what happened. The county issued a formal apology, though no one alive bore the guilt directly. But apologies couldn't reach the dead, and they couldn't rebuild what had been lost in the living. For Richard, the revelation brought no triumph, only a kind of weary clarity. He hadn't cleared his family's name, he had rewritten it. From that point forward, the Collins legacy would be both curse and confession. Emily came home not long after the story faded from the news. The first thing she did when she stepped through the door was embrace her father. She didn't say a word about the past months, about the interviews or the people who had called them liars. They didn't need words. In her eyes, he saw exhaustion, but also forgiveness. Luke returned a week later, thinner, quieter, but with a sense of purpose that hadn't been there before. He helped rebuild the barn, though neither of them mentioned the fire. The younger children filled the yard again with noise, their laughter carrying through the open windows. The house began to breathe differently, cautiously at first, like a wounded animal testing the air. Allison came often during those weeks, bringing boxes of documents the university no longer wanted. She and Richard sorted through them at the kitchen table in the evenings, sipping coffee while the children slept upstairs. Together they planned what to do with the property. "You could sell," she suggested once, though she said it without conviction. He shook his head. "This place isn't something to sell. It's a story, and stories don't belong to one person." It was she who proposed turning the land into a small memorial site, a place where people could come to learn what had happened, to stand on the soil where two families' histories had collided. At first he resisted, but the idea stayed with him. The farm had already been a grave once. Maybe it could become something else. The first visitors arrived in early summer. They came quietly, by car and on foot, some from neighboring towns, others from as far as Boston. Many were descendants of those who had lived in the area when the Moores were alive. They walked the path behind the house down to the creek where the tunnel had ended. The FBI had filled the passage for safety, leaving the earth newly seeded with wildflowers. Near the old oak tree stood a wooden sign carved by Luke's hands. "To those whose truth was buried, we remember." Beneath it, a simple stone plaque listed the names of the dead and the date they were found. No speeches were made that day, only silence. It was a silence that felt right, neither heavy nor empty, but full of something that had been missing for a century. The town changed slowly after that. Some residents still crossed the street when Richard passed, but others stopped to talk, awkward at first, then with growing ease. The mayor eventually invited him to speak at the local high school about the importance of confronting the past, though he declined. He didn't want to be a symbol. He wanted to be a man who had done what he could and gone back to living. Yet the story refused to fade completely. Each year, a few more people came to the memorial. They brought flowers, old photographs, and sometimes nothing at all, just themselves, standing in the quiet by the creek, eyes closed against the wind. One evening near the end of summer, Richard and Allison stood by the fence line watching the sunset. The rebuilt barn behind them glowed orange in the fading light. She turned to him and said softly, "Do you ever wish you hadn't opened that wall?" He thought for a long moment before answering. "Sometimes it cost more than I thought it would. But if I hadn't, we'd still be living in someone else's silence." Maybe that's worse. She nodded, understanding, and together they watched the sky darken to a deep, forgiving blue. Inside the house, the children were preparing for dinner. Emily was teaching the twins to cook, their laughter rising through the open door. For the first time in years, the air smelled of food and not of dust. Richard went in, washed his hands, and joined them. The table was crowded and loud, full of interruptions and spilled milk, and yet it was perfect. After the plates were cleared, he walked out to the porch alone. Fireflies blinked in the tall grass, the night warm and still. He thought of Sarah, of how much she had loved this place, of the promise he'd made to her the night she died, that he would keep the family together no matter what. He had failed in ways he couldn't count, but maybe, just maybe, he had also kept his word. Weeks later, he and the children planted a sapling near the memorial. A young willow to replace the one that had given the creek its name, but died decades earlier. They worked in silence, the sound of shovels and the rustle of leaves mingling with the steady hum of the water. When they finished, they stood together looking at the fragile tree swaying in the breeze. "Will it live, Dad?" one of the twins asked. Richard smiled faintly. "If we take care of it, it will." The boy thought for a moment, then said, "Maybe it'll remember too." Richard placed a hand on his shoulder. Maybe that's the point. That night, after everyone was asleep, he sat by the window with a cup of tea, staring out at the field. The moonlight touched the new willow, making it shimmer like something half-remembered. The air was warm, the world quiet except for the distant call of an owl. He thought about how much had changed and how much never would. The land still held its scars, but it also held life. It was no longer haunted, only honest. He took a deep breath and felt, for the first time in years, that the house was breathing with him. When autumn returned, the leaves turned gold along the creek. Tourists came less often, the memorial quieter now. Richard didn't mind. He preferred it that way. On the anniversary of the discovery, he went down alone to the spot where the tunnel had once opened. The willow had taken root, its branches already brushing the surface of the water. He knelt and laid a single flower at the base of the tree. The breeze carried the scent of the fields and the faint sound of his children's voices playing somewhere in the distance. He closed his eyes and whispered, "It's all yours now, Sarah. The truth, the land, the peace." As he stood to leave, he looked back at the house, its windows glowing softly in the fading light. The past no longer reached for him from the shadows. It was behind him, but not gone. It lived here, woven into the soil, into every nail and beam, into every breath of his children. It wasn't a burden anymore. It was simply what remained. If this story kept you watching till the end, don't leave yet. Hit that subscribe button so you don't miss what comes next. There's another shocking story waiting right here. Click to watch it now, and share this video with someone who loves uncovering hidden truths. You won't believe what's coming next.